Could you imagine a world where the very ground beneath your feet, the land that sustained your family for generations, was something you could never truly call your own? What if your dreams of managing a bustling farm, inheriting a sprawling estate, or simply owning a small plot to call home were crushed before you even took your first breath, all because of your gender? And what if this wasn't just a fleeting injustice, but a deep-rooted system that existed in 990? Number 12. Absence of political voice and legal reform. Imagine trying to change a rule that directly affects your life, but you are not allowed to even sit at the table where the rules are made. That was the stark reality for women in 990 when it came to owning land. The laws that governed land ownership were not written in a vacuum. They were crafted by kings, by powerful lords in their great halls, by bishops in their spiritual councils, and sometimes by gatherings of important men from across a region. These were the legislative bodies of the time, the places where customs were codified into law, where new decrees were issued, and where the very framework of society was shaped. And guess who was conspicuously absent from these assemblies? Think about it. Not a single woman held a recognized position of power in these councils. No queen, unless acting as regent for an underage son, held a permanent seat in lawmaking. No noblewoman, however wealthy or influential, was invited to debate the fine points of inheritance or property rights. This meant that the laws being formed, the traditions being cemented, and the very concept of land ownership were filtered entirely through the perspective and experiences of men. Their priorities, their understanding of lineage, their needs for defense and feudal service, these were the driving forces behind the legal systems that evolved. So, when a law was debated concerning who inherited land, the voices in the room were those of fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. They designed systems that favored their own line, that ensured stability for their male heirs, and that kept wealth and power within their gender's control. If a law proposed that land should always pass to the eldest son, there was no daughter, no mother, no sister in that assembly to speak up and say, "Wait, what about us? What about our right to sustenance, our ability to manage land, our contributions?" Their perspectives simply were not heard. Their very existence as potential independent landholders was, for all practical purposes, ignored by the legislative process. This absence of a political voice was a massive barrier, because it created a self-reinforcing cycle. Laws that excluded women from land ownership were made by men who benefited from those laws. These laws then shaped social expectations, which in turn reinforced the idea that women had no place in lawmaking, leading to more laws that excluded women. It was like a giant invisible wall, built brick by brick over centuries, with each brick laid by male hands and minds. There was no mechanism, no pathway for women to advocate for themselves within the legal system. They could not propose new laws, could not challenge existing ones in a legislative sense, and could not even vote for representatives who might champion their cause. Concept of universal suffrage, where everyone has a say in who makes the laws, was a distant dream, centuries away. In 990, the ability to shape the legal landscape was a privilege reserved exclusively for men, and this privilege directly contributed to the systematic exclusion of women from land ownership. The very notion of legal reform to grant women property rights was simply beyond the horizon of thought for most people in positions of power during that era. It was a world constructed by men, for men, and the land laws were a clear reflection of that deeply ingrained male dominance. Number 11. The burden of estate management. Imagine inheriting a massive enterprise, but you have no training, no recognized authority, and society expects you to fail. That was often the grim reality for a woman who might against all odds find herself in a position to manage land in 990 AD. Owning land in the medieval period, especially a significant estate, was far more than just possessing a title deed. It was a colossal, relentless, and physically demanding responsibility. This was not a passive investment. It was an active, hands-on, and often dangerous job that few women were prepared or allowed to undertake. Consider what managing an estate truly entailed during this time. You were responsible for overseeing an entire miniature economy. You had to ensure the fields were plowed and sown at the correct times, often supervising a workforce of serfs or peasants who might be resistant or resentful of a female overseer. You had to manage the harvest, ensuring the grain was collected, stored safely, and transported to market or used to feed your own people. This meant understanding crop rotation, soil quality, and the vagaries of weather. It was a complex agricultural science, albeit one based on generations of practical knowledge. Beyond the fields, there were livestock to manage. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, their health, breeding, and feeding schedules all fell under the estate manager's purview. Then there were the buildings, the manor house itself, barns, stables, mills, and various outbuildings. They constantly needed repair, maintenance, and sometimes construction, mediating with master builders, ensuring supplies arrived, and overseeing labor tasks typically handled by men. But it was more than just agriculture and maintenance. An estate manager was also a judge, a tax collector, and often a defender. They held local courts, settling disputes between tenants, arbitrating arguments, and enforcing local customs, collected rents and taxes, whether in coin, kind, or labor, and had to keep meticulous records of these transactions, a challenge in an era of limited literacy. And in a volatile world, they were responsible for the defense of their land and its people. This might mean maintaining a small retinue of armed men, understanding local skirmishes, or even leading defenses against raiders. These were duties almost universally associated with male authority and physical prowess. Society, in 990, had largely viewed women as physically weaker and emotionally unsuited for such demanding public and often confrontational roles. Their education, if they received any, beyond basic literacy and household skills, rarely prepared them for estate management. They were taught to run a household, perhaps manage servants, and oversee domestic chores, but not to command a workforce of hundreds, negotiate land deals, or defend a manor from attack. Even if a woman possessed the intellect and determination, she would face an uphill battle. Her authority might be questioned by tenants, challenged by neighboring lords, and undermined by her own household staff, who were accustomed to male leadership. The practical difficulties were immense. Travel to market, attending court sessions, or riding to inspect distant parts of the estate could be dangerous for a woman traveling alone or with a small retinue. Negotiating with powerful male merchants or rival landholders required a level of assertiveness and public presence that was considered unseemly for women of high standing. So, even if a woman legally inherited land, the immense practical burden of managing it often meant she had to delegate authority to a male relative, a steward, or a new husband. This effectively stripped her of true control, making her ownership largely nominal and demonstrating how the sheer scope of the task was a formidable barrier to independent female landholding. Number 10. Customary law and local practices. Imagine rules that everyone just knows are true, even if they aren't written down anywhere. These unwritten rules passed down through generations, often held more power than any royal decree in 990. This was the realm of customary law and local practices, and they formed a deeply entrenched, often invisible barrier to women owning land. In many regions, the laws were not centrally codified in vast books. Instead, they were traditions, habits, and understandings that had evolved within a specific community over centuries. These local customs dictated everything from how much grain a peasant owed to the lord, to who inherited a blacksmith's forge, to who could sit on the village council. And within this complex web of unwritten rules, the patriarchy was usually woven into the very fiber of daily life. For instance, in one village, it might be the accepted wisdom that upon the death of a landowner, the land always passes to the eldest son, even if there are younger daughters who might be more capable or in greater need. There was no specific written law for this in a central legal code, but it was the way things were done. Everyone knew it. Everyone expected it. This reliance on unwritten custom made it incredibly difficult for women to challenge the status quo. If a woman tried to assert a claim to land that traditionally went to a male relative, she wasn't just going against a piece of paper. She was going against the collective memory and deeply held beliefs of an entire community. Her neighbors, her family, even the local lord who oversaw justice in the area would likely side with the established custom. To them, she was not just seeking her due, she was disrupting the social order, challenging tradition, and potentially undermining the very stability of their community. Consider the force of social pressure in a small, interconnected medieval village. If a woman tried to break with custom, she could face ostracism, ridicule, and a complete lack of support. Her pleas might be dismissed as unreasonable, her claims as illogical. The local informal courts, often presided over by the lord or a group of respected male elders, would base their judgments on these very customs. They would interpret these unwritten laws in favor of the established male line, simply because that was how it had always been, and how they believed it should be. Furthermore, customary law often reflected the immediate needs and priorities of a local community. If a village frequently faced raids, the custom might heavily favor male land ownership because men were seen as the protectors of the land. If a community depended on a specific craft passed down through male apprenticeships, the associated land might also be customarily reserved for male heirs. These practices, though unwritten, were powerful and resistant to change. They were deeply rooted in the daily lives and collective consciousness of the people, making them incredibly difficult to overturn without a powerful external force or a radical shift in societal values, neither of which were present for women in 990 AD. The unwritten rules of local custom were thus a silent yet immensely effective barrier to women ever truly establishing widespread independent land ownership. Number 9. The dowry system versus inheritance. Imagine being given a significant gift upon your wedding day, but that gift isn't truly yours to control, and it also means you might not get anything else later. This was the intricate and often frustrating reality of the dowry system for women in 990, and which served as a significant barrier to their independent land ownership. The dowry, often referred to as the marriage portion, was a transfer of property or wealth from the bride's family to the groom or his family upon marriage. It could consist of money, movable goods, livestock, or even land. However, here's the crucial distinction. While land might be part of the dowry, it was almost never truly owned by the bride in her own right. Instead, the land in a dowry was typically managed by the husband, becoming part of the marital property that he controlled. Purpose was to support the wife during the marriage and, crucially, to provide for her in widowhood. It was a form of financial security for the wife and often a way for her family to contribute to the new household and ensure their daughter was well provided for. It was a powerful tool for forging alliances between families and for ensuring the bride's status within her new home. But it was not about independent land ownership for the woman. The dowry system acted as a barrier in several key ways. First, it effectively became a woman's share of her family's wealth, given up front at her marriage. Because she had received this portion, she was then often excluded from inheriting her family's primary landholdings, which would typically pass to her brothers under principles like primogeniture or male preference. Her dowry was seen as her inheritance, fulfilling her claim to the family's assets, even if it meant she would never truly own land. It was a common saying, or unwritten rule, that a woman received her portion as a dowry and was therefore not expected to inherit the family estate. Second, even when land was included in the dowry, it was almost always placed under the husband's administration. He had the legal right to manage it, cultivate it, collect its revenues, and often even sell or mortgage it, sometimes without needing his wife's explicit consent. While there might have been agreements for her eventual return to her family if the marriage dissolved or he passed away, during the marriage her control over the land was nominal at best. It was her husband who exercised the power of an owner. Third, the dowry was contingent on marriage. If a woman never married, she would not receive a dowry, and her options for gaining land or significant wealth might be extremely limited, pushing her towards a convent or a life of dependence. If a marriage failed, the complexities of dowry return were enormous, and often meant the woman lost her financial security. So, while the dowry system seemingly provided women with some form of property, it fundamentally distinguished itself from independent ownership. It was a system designed to transfer wealth from one male household head to another, with the woman serving as the conduit. It reinforced the idea that a woman's economic life was inherently tied to and dependent on a male relative, first her father, then her husband. It ensured that significant independent land tenure remained overwhelmingly in male hands, as women's share was often a conditional arrangement, not a full grant of ownership and control. Number 8. Physical conjugality and security. Imagine trying to hold on to something incredibly valuable when you are constantly at risk of attack, and society dictates that your primary role is not defense. This precarious reality was a significant, if often unstated, barrier to women owning land in 990. The medieval world was, to put it mildly, a dangerous place. Life was often brutal, and land, being the primary source of wealth and power, was a constant target. Landowners had to be prepared to defend their property, sometimes with their very lives, and this responsibility was almost universally seen as a male domain. In a time before strong centralized governments and policing forces, disputes over land could quickly escalate into violent clashes. Raids by bandits, incursions from neighboring lords, and even full-scale invasions were not uncommon. Landowners, especially those with substantial estates, were expected to maintain a retinue of armed men, perhaps even a fortified manor house or small castle. They were often required as part of their feudal obligations to provide military service to their overlord, leading troops into battle. This was a world where a lord's authority was often backed by his ability to raise and command soldiers. For women, this presented a profound challenge. Society, in 990, generally did not train women in combat, nor did it expect them to lead troops or stand on the battlements. While some exceptional women might have proven themselves capable of defense in times of siege, these were rare exceptions, not the rule. The expectation was that a woman would be protected, not a protector. This fundamental social norm meant that if a woman were to own land independently, she would constantly face a severe security deficit. Who would protect her estate from raiders? Who would lead the local militia if a neighboring lord encroached on her borders? Who would represent her in a trial by combat, a legal practice where disputes were settled through single combat? Answer was almost always a male relative, a steward, or a husband. This reliance on a male protector, while necessary for her safety and the preservation of the land, simultaneously undermined her claim to independent ownership. If she could not defend the land herself, was she truly its undisputed master? Furthermore, simply traveling to and from her estate, or to market, or to court, could be fraught with danger. Roads were often infested with thieves, and a woman of wealth, especially if traveling alone or with minimal protection, was a prime target. This physical vulnerability restricted her mobility and her ability to actively manage and oversee her land, forcing her to rely even more heavily on male agents. the perceived inability of women to provide physical defense and security for their land made them less desirable landholders in a chaotic world. It reinforced the notion that land ownership was intrinsically tied to male roles of protection and military leadership. Even if a woman possessed the legal right to land, the practical, dangerous realities of the medieval world often meant that true, unencumbered control remained elusive, serving as a powerful, unspoken barrier to her independence. Number 7. Lack of independent economic means. Imagine a world where nearly every pathway to earning significant wealth is closed off to you, leaving you perpetually dependent on others. This was the stark economic reality for most women in 990 AD, and it served as a fundamental barrier to land ownership. Land, being the primary source of wealth in the medieval period, was expensive. Acquiring it, whether through purchase, inheritance, or grant, required significant economic power. And for the vast majority of women, that power simply did not exist independently. In 990, the economy was overwhelmingly agricultural and feudal. Wealth was concentrated in land and commercial ventures. Though slowly growing, were largely dominated by men. Most women did not earn wages in the modern sense. Their labor, whether on a peasant farm or in a noble household, was integrated into the family unit and contributed to the household's overall production. But they rarely had control over the fruits of that labor or separate independent income streams. For a peasant woman, her work was integral to the farm's survival. She spun wool, tended a garden, raised children, and assisted in the fields. The yield of that labor belonged to the family, specifically to the male head of the household. She could not sell a portion of the harvest to accumulate her own savings to buy land. For noble women, their roles were primarily domestic, managing the household, overseeing servants, educating children, and sometimes acting as hostess. While they managed considerable resources, these resources were their husbands' or fathers'. They were stewards, not owners. There were very few avenues for women to accumulate significant independent wealth. Some widows, if their husbands died without male heirs and left them with dower rights, might have temporary control over land and its income. Some women might enter religious orders and become abbesses, which often involved managing extensive monastic lands. But this was communal ownership for the church, not individual ownership. A very small number of women might engage in trade, particularly in urban areas, but even then their scale was limited, and land was usually outside their purview. This meant that even if a woman had the legal right to purchase land, she almost certainly lacked the financial means to do so. Land was rarely for sale in the way we understand it today. It was usually inherited, granted, or acquired through marriage alliances. And even when land changed hands through purchase, it required vast sums of capital that was overwhelmingly controlled by men. Women did not have bank accounts, did not have independent credit, and were generally not engaged in the large-scale commercial activities that generated the liquid wealth necessary for land acquisition. The economic reality of 990 AD ensured that land remained in the hands of those who commanded the greatest financial resources, which, overwhelmingly, were men. Without their own means of generating and controlling significant wealth, women were locked out of the primary form of capital accumulation and power in the medieval world, making independent land ownership a practical impossibility for all but the most extraordinary and rare circumstances. Their economic dependence was a silent but incredibly strong chain, binding them away from the earth they longed to call their own. Number 6. Religious interpretations and patriarchal doctrine. Imagine a society where the spiritual teachings that guide people's lives consistently place one gender in a position of subservience, subtly reinforcing their exclusion from earthly power. This was a powerful, pervasive barrier for women seeking to own land in 990 AD, stemming from dominant religious interpretations of the time. In medieval Europe, Christianity was not just a faith. It was the foundational framework for society, law, and morality. The teachings of the Church deeply influenced how people understood gender, roles, authority, and ownership. Christian doctrine, particularly as interpreted by male theologians and church leaders, often emphasized the story of Adam and Eve, portraying Eve as responsible for the fall and subject to Adam. Passages from the Pauline epistles, for instance, were frequently cited to assert male headship within the family and the church. Texts like "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord" were understood not just as marital advice, but as a divine mandate for female subordination across all aspects of life. This religious framework created a powerful moral and intellectual justification for the patriarchal social structure. If women were to be submissive in the home and silent in the church, how could they possibly be seen as independent landholders, commanding authority over others, dealing with public affairs, and exercising economic power? It was believed that a woman's primary role was within the domestic sphere, as a wife, a mother, a household manager. Her spiritual fulfillment was often seen as tied to purity, piety, and supporting her husband's endeavors, not to accumulating worldly possessions or wielding secular power. Church teachings also profoundly influenced legal thought. Many medieval jurists and legal scholars were also clerics, or at least deeply steeped in Christian theology. They naturally integrated these gendered interpretations into the emerging legal systems, viewing male control over property and family as part of God's natural order. For example, the concept of a husband being the head of the household with ultimate authority over his wife and her property was directly supported by widely accepted religious beliefs. Furthermore, the church itself was a massive landholder, and its internal hierarchy was almost exclusively male. Bishops, abbots, and priests managed vast estates, and their positions of authority were closed to women. This institutional example further reinforced the idea that land management and significant economic power were male prerogatives. The few exceptions, like powerful abbesses who managed considerable monastic lands, did so within a communal religious context, not as independent secular landowners, and even their authority was often circumscribed by male bishops. So, beyond the explicit laws or social customs, there was a deeply ingrained spiritual rationale for female subordination. This belief system permeated every aspect of medieval life, from the education children received to the sermons preached in every village church. Subtly but powerfully shaped perceptions, making the idea of an independent female landowner seem not just unusual, but potentially unnatural, even against God's will. This pervasive religious doctrine served as a powerful, unspoken barrier, reinforcing all the other legal and social hurdles women faced in their pursuit of land ownership. Number 5. Social expectations and gender torch. Imagine a world where your entire life's path, from the moment you are born, is rigidly defined by whether you are male or female, with very little room for deviation. This was the crushing reality of social expectations and gender roles. In 990 AD, acting as a colossal, invisible barrier to women owning land. Society had very clear, deeply ingrained ideas about what a man should be and what a woman should be. These ideas were not just suggestions, they were powerful norms that shaped every aspect of life, from education and work to marriage and public presence. Men were expected to be the protectors, the providers, the warriors, the leaders in the public sphere. Their roles often involved physical strength, command, negotiation, and engagement with the world outside the home. These roles naturally aligned with the responsibilities of land ownership, defending the estate, managing agricultural labor, participating in feudal obligations, and engaging in legal disputes. A man's identity, his status, and his very worth were often tied to his land and his ability to manage and protect. Women, on the other hand, were overwhelmingly expected to be confined to the domestic sphere. Their primary roles revolved around managing the household, bearing and raising children, overseeing servants, and contributing to the family's welfare through domestic tasks like spinning, weaving, cooking, and tending to the garden. While their work was vital, it was almost always seen as being within the home, under the authority of a male head. A woman's honor and reputation were tied to her chastity, her piety, and her ability to produce male heirs. This rigid division meant that the idea of a woman engaging in public land transactions, managing vast estates, overseeing male laborers, or participating in the rough and tumble world of medieval land disputes was seen as deeply unconventional, even improper. Such activities were considered men's work, and outside the natural order of things. A woman who tried to step into these roles might be viewed with suspicion, scorn, or even pity. She might be considered unwomanly, assertive to a fault, or simply incapable. Consider the enormous social pressure. If a woman inherited land, she might face disapproval from her family, her community, and her neighbors. They might subtly or overtly encourage her to marry quickly so that her new husband could take over the management. If she resisted, she might find herself isolated, her decisions questioned, and her authority undermined. People might refuse to deal with her or challenge her commands simply because she was a woman trying to perform a man's role. Furthermore, the education and upbringing of boys and girls reflected these roles. Boys from landowning families would be trained in estate management, horsemanship, military skills, and perhaps rudimentary law or literacy to handle documents. Girls, even noble ones, would learn household management, perhaps some basic literacy for religious texts, and skills related to being a suitable wife and mother. They were simply not prepared, by design, for the demands of land ownership. The weight of these deeply ingrained social expectations was an almost insurmountable barrier, making it socially unacceptable and practically challenging for women to pursue, let alone maintain, independent land ownership. Number 4. Limited access to legal education and representation. Imagine trying to navigate a complex labyrinth of rules and traditions, but you are never taught how to read the map, and the guides only speak to men. This was the reality for women in 990 AD when it came to legal matters forming a significant barrier to land ownership. The legal systems of the medieval period were not simple. They were a mix of customary law, feudal obligations, royal decrees, and church law, often unwritten, localized, and incredibly complex. Understanding these laws, interpreting land grants, negotiating contracts, or defending claims in court required specialized knowledge, and this knowledge was overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of men. Literacy rates in 990 AD were extremely low for the general population, but even lower for women. While some noble women might have learned to read religious texts or basic letters, formal legal education was almost non-existent for them. There were no law schools for women, no apprenticeships with scribes or notaries. The men who handled legal documents, the clerks, the monastic scribes, the royal officials, were almost exclusively male. These were the individuals who wrote charters, recorded land transfers, and advised lords on legal matters. Women were simply not part of this professional sphere. This lack of literacy and formal legal education meant that a woman would be at a severe disadvantage when dealing with land. How could she verify the terms of a charter? How could she understand the implications of a feudal contract? How could she write a will to ensure her land passed as she wished? She would be entirely dependent on male intermediaries, her father, her husband, a male scribe, or a male relative, to interpret these crucial documents for her. This dependence inherently eroded her autonomy and control over the land. Furthermore, Accessing legal representation in courts was equally challenging. Medieval courts were often public, male-dominated spaces where disputes were settled through arguments, sworn oaths, and sometimes even physical combat or ordeal. A woman rarely had the standing to represent herself effectively in such a setting. Her voice might be dismissed, her arguments overlooked, or her claims simply not taken seriously by the male judges and jury of peers. She would almost certainly need a male advocate, a husband, a father, a brother, or a hired male representative to speak for her, even if a woman were the legitimate heir to land. The process of proving her claim, defending it against rivals, or simply navigating the bureaucracy of the feudal system was a legal minefield. Without direct access to legal knowledge or the ability to represent herself, she was vulnerable to manipulation, misinformation, or simply being outmaneuvered by better-informed male claimants. This systemic exclusion from legal education and representation ensured that even when a woman had a theoretical right to land, the practical ability to assert and maintain that right was often beyond her reach, making it a formidable barrier to true ownership. Number 3, feudal obligations and military service. Imagine holding a valuable asset, but it comes with a strict set of duties that you are legally and socially barred from performing. This was the intricate dilemma for women in 990 regarding land ownership within the sprawling system known as feudalism. In medieval Europe, land was not simply a commodity. It was the foundation of political and social power, and it came with a heavy price: obligation. Feudalism was a system where land known as a fief or a feud was granted by a lord to a vassal in exchange for loyalty, homage, and, most crucially, military service. This fundamental connection between land and the sword created an immense barrier for women. A lord granted land to a vassal who in return promised to provide a certain number of knights, soldiers, or military resources whenever the lord called upon them. This meant that the land itself was intrinsically linked to the ability to raise and lead an army. If you held a substantial fief, you were expected to be a military leader, capable of commanding men in battle, defending your territory, and participating in your overlord's campaigns. Your status, your power, and your very right to the land were tied to your martial prowess. And here's where women faced an insurmountable challenge. Society in 990 did not train women to be warriors or military commanders. They were not expected to ride into battle, lead troops, or oversee the construction and defense of fortifications. These were exclusively male roles, seen as fundamental to the duties of a landholder. While a woman might manage a household or even a village in her husband's absence, she was not expected to perform the active military service that was the bedrock of feudal land tenure. So, what happened if a woman inherited a fief? In many cases, it was understood that she could not fulfill the military obligations directly. This often meant one of several things. The land might revert to the overlord. If the woman was unable to provide the required military service, the lord who granted the land might reclaim it, as the primary condition of the grant was unfulfilled. She would be pressured to marry quickly. The expectation was that she would marry a man who could fulfill the military obligations. Her husband would then perform the service in her stead, effectively taking control of the land and exercising the rights and duties of the fief holder. This meant her ownership was always contingent on finding a suitable male proxy. A male guardian or steward would be appointed. If she was a child or if she was a widow without an immediate male heir, a male relative or a steward would be appointed to manage the land and fulfill the military duties, once again diminishing her direct control and authority. There were, of course, rare historical exceptions of powerful women who, through sheer force of will, extraordinary circumstances, or strategic marriages, managed to hold on to or even influence substantial land. But these were celebrated precisely because they defied the norm. For the vast majority of women, the feudal system's inherent demand for military service was a structural barrier that ensured land ownership remained overwhelmingly in male hands, as it was directly linked to duties that only men were expected or allowed to perform. Number 2. Coverture-like concepts and marital control. Imagine losing your legal identity and control over your own property the moment you say, "I do." While the specific term coverture developed more formally later, the underlying legal and social principles that stripped married women of their independent property rights were very much alive and well in 990, forming a staggering barrier to land ownership. In this era, upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was, for all practical purposes, subsumed by her husband's. Her identity became legally merged with his, creating a single legal entity, the married couple, represented by the husband. This meant that any property a woman brought into the marriage, including land, or any land she might inherit during the marriage, typically fell under her husband's control and administration. He gained extensive rights over her property, effectively becoming its manager and often its de facto owner for the duration of the marriage. He could collect its revenues, make decisions about its cultivation, and even sell or mortgage it without her explicit consent. While she might retain a theoretical interest in the property, the practical power to control or dispose of it resided with her husband. Consider the profound implications of this. A woman who was a wealthy heiress before marriage, perhaps with extensive landholdings, would upon marrying see control over those lands shift to her husband. He would be the one who attended court, negotiated with tenants, made decisions about crops, and represented the family in land disputes. Her role would be limited to advising him. If he chose to listen, or overseeing the domestic side of the estate, her ownership became a hollow title, stripped of real power. This system was designed to consolidate power and property within the male head of the household. It ensured that family wealth remained under male control and that the husband had the necessary authority to manage the family's assets, fulfill feudal obligations, and maintain social standing. It also simplified legal dealings, as there was only one legal representative for the married couple. The only significant exception to this complete loss of control was the concept of dower or dowry, which, as mentioned before, provided for a widow's maintenance from her deceased husband's lands. This was typically a portion of his land, often 1/3, that she could live off for the remainder of her life. But crucially, she usually could not sell or permanently dispose of it. It reverted to his male heirs upon her death. So, even in widowhood, her control was limited, and it was a right to sustenance, not outright ownership of land. The principle of marital control, whether formalized as coverture or operating through customary law, fundamentally undermined any woman's independent ability to own and manage land once she was married. Marriage, which was almost universally expected for women, effectively extinguished her independent property rights for the duration of the union. It ensured that land, the bedrock of medieval power, remained firmly in the hands of men, creating a legal and social structure where women's aspirations for independent land ownership were consistently curtailed by the very institution of marriage. Number 1. Primogeniture and male preference in inheritance. Imagine being born into a wealthy landowning family, but knowing from your very first breath that no matter how capable or deserving you might be, the vast majority of the family's assets, especially the land, will inevitably pass to your brother even if he is younger, less intelligent. This was the crushing reality of primogeniture and the pervasive male preference in inheritance that stood as arguably the single most significant barrier to women owning land in 990 AD. This system wasn't just a custom. It was often enshrined in law and deeply woven into the very structure of medieval society, ensuring that land remained almost exclusively in male hands. Primogeniture at its core is the principle by which the eldest son inherits all, or the overwhelming majority of his deceased parents' land and other property. In cases where strict primogeniture wasn't formally codified, a strong preference for male heirs still dominated. This meant that if a family had a son, no matter how many daughters they had, the land would pass directly to him. Daughters were routinely bypassed, their claims to family land subjugated to that of their brothers, or even more distant male relatives. The rationale behind primogeniture was multifaceted and deeply practical for the medieval world. It aimed to keep large estates intact, preventing the fragmentation of valuable landholdings that could weaken a family's power, military strength, and economic viability. Consolidated estate meant greater wealth, stronger defenses, and more stable feudal relationships. If land were divided among all children, estates would shrink with each generation, eventually becoming too small to support a noble family or provide the necessary military service to an overlord. Furthermore, primogeniture reinforced the patriarchal structure of society and the feudal system. Since land ownership came with military obligations and political responsibilities, it was deemed essential for a male capable of warfare and leadership to inherit the estate. The eldest son was seen as the natural successor to the father's role as protector, warrior, and head of the household. Daughters, as discussed in previous barriers, were not seen as capable of fulfilling these duties directly. So what did this mean for daughters? They were typically excluded from inheriting the main land holdings. Instead, their share of the family wealth often came in the form of a dowry when they married. This dowry, which we've already explored, was a payment or property that transferred to the husband's control, not something the woman owned independently. It was her portion given to her at marriage, and it generally precluded her from making further claims on the family's ancestral lands. In a family with no sons, the situation became more complex, but still heavily favored male control. The land might pass to the deceased father's brother, nephew, or even a more distant male cousin rather than to his daughters. Sometimes, a daughter might inherit the land in default of male heirs, but even then it often came with the expectation that she would marry quickly, transferring control to her husband, or that a male guardian would manage it for her until she produced a male heir. These female heiresses were often considered valuable marriage prospects precisely because they brought land, but it was the husband who would then effectively control and manage that land. Primogeniture and the pervasive male preference in inheritance systematically diverted land away from women, ensuring that it flowed predominantly down male lines. It was a deeply ingrained legal and social principle that more than any other single factor cemented the male dominance of land ownership in 990, and making it an almost insurmountable hurdle for any woman dreaming of holding land independently.